Hey guys, I've been wanting to make a video about the new plugin Stardust for After Effects, and I didn't really know where to start, but I figured the best place to start, since I get a lot of questions, is what's the difference between Stardust and the Trapcode Particular? And in this case, I'm actually going to compare it to the full Trapcode Suite because there's a lot of features that are kind of outside of just particular use. So we're going to be looking at probably form, tau, mirror, and 3D stroke. But to get started, first and foremost, if you apply both these effects to a layer, right out of the box you get a very similar effect. And so I think a lot of people instantly think these two are one and the same. But if you're a user of particular, you know that you get kind of one emitter, which can be, various types of sources, box, sphere, grid, layers, and then you have one auxiliary system. And if you wanted to make multiple particle systems, you would have to have multiple layers. What Stardust does is create a unified 3D space and allows you to create multiple layered and creative effects in a node-based environment. So if I click open, you'll see that you have your standard effects on the side where you're controlling all your settings just like particular, but the difference here is that now to create our emitters and different effectors, we are given a toolbar, and this is our workspace. So to show like a very simple setup, I've created here just one emitter with one particle type rendering, but I've created a couple of different variants on that, and you can see that I can plug. Using one emitter, I can give 3 different particle rendering types to a single emitter. And right there, kind of right off the bat, is kind of what node-based workflow inside of Stardust is really like. It gives you this flexibility to apply effectors or particle rendering types to singular parts of the system or the whole system. And so that's one of the biggest takeaways, and something that's kind of hard and abstract to understand initially, but hopefully as I go through kind of some more of the plugin, it kind of really starts to make a little sense. So the first thing, I've kind of set up these different pre-comps to try to make this like go quicker, because again, I don't want to get in depth into all of the settings and what they do and why they're there, but more of just kind of an overview of what's happening under the hood. The first thing I wanted to talk about was emitters. So if we look under our emitters, we have a lot of things in common with particular. We have, like I said, the point, box, sphere, layer, and grid and light are the ones that are kind of shared amongst particular, but we also have a couple of other really cool options like text and mask, and ring, object, which is OBJs, and splines and layer paths. So to kind of look at a couple of those, I've set up, again, another scene and just set up a couple of examples just to look at those. So this is using text as an emitter under the dropdown, and under layer properties, I've assigned it to this live text layer that I have in my scene, which could be adjusted, and you don't have to set your text to be, oops, forgot the T. You don't have to like convert it to curves or anything to feed it to it. It's kind of live, and it's nice just to have that feature. And then again, like each one of these, as you pick them, gives you kind of a plethora of settings to play with. Something that you can do is like, it uses the path as normal, so you could kind of emit along them, which is really nice. And, this kind of goes into a ton of different options. You can emit from the edges, you can emit from the volume inside of it. There's a lot of play that you can have there. The next one, and mask. So mask are really nice. If I can turn these on here, you'll see I have a layer set up where I've set up some concentric circles, and I'm using those as paths to emit along. So this is I've found this super helpful for when you're kind of creating UI. Imagine importing a set of Illustrator curves into After Effects, just copying and pasting them on the layer, and all of a sudden you've kind of already have the majority of your setup built out. And then if you broke these out into multiple layers, you can control them individually, Say if I wanted this ring on a separate layer, then I could emit from that, and instead of the outside ones. These masks can also be animated, which is something that you really can't do with a particular. So here I have an example of a mask that I'm just rotating. It's not even the points are animating, but you could animate the points. If I just swap out the render type, just because I've made it a shorter life instead of a constant life, you can see. I have to switch the layer too. You can see that my particles are, being born, and then they're matching where that particle is in its time. So that's really powerful, and it opens a lot of flexibility in what you can do with an emitter type. So that's mask. Grids, are your kind of typical grid, like if you would think of like how form would emit. And then what's nice is like you can get these uniform lines, and you can displace this, you can repeat it, and you can do a lot of things with that. And in the same notion, there is you could do a box if you wanted. This is a single particle plane on the Z, but you could have multiples. So a grid, really useful if you wanted to map an image along it. There's a lot of uses for that. A ring emitter is, as it suggests, gives you a circumference to emit along, which is nice that it recognizes that outer surface as normal, so that when you emit outwards from that point, it actually is using that as its source, or you could do directional if you wanted to do it. But it's just really powerful in that. And also I would say that for the mask layers as well, that any mask that you draw, it recognizes the normal, so that becomes like something really powerful. I have a couple of mask animations to show, like just kind of, this is using a repeater. You can just kind of set up some really kind of cool, interesting animations really quickly, simply. Like, this is just using an emitter, particle type, and then a replicator to get a couple in the Z. So again, it's really powerful tools and tools at your disposal to kind of create some layered and interesting effects. The last one I was going to quickly show was path. Here I've taken a null object and animated it in like this flower shape with a motion sketch, and using that as the source, you can see that the particles are following along it and kind of moving alongside it. So that's pretty cool if you have an object tracking in your scene, and you've tracked a bunch of nulls to something. It's an easy way to kind of use that path as a source for emission. And then the last one that is one of the most powerful that I think is super interesting is the spline. The spline takes lights and uses them as points on a path. So here I have these lights in order, animating, kind of up and down, and the spline, as you can see, is creating a line along those, which is nice because then you can control the density, you can animate along it. There's a lot of really cool, fun things that can happen with this, and also it opens up underneath the particle rendering type. It gives you these kind of attributes over the spline to play with, so you can do some interesting tapering. You can mix the colors. You can play with the opacity. There's a lot of flexibility here that is really nice to mess with. And then again, you can instantly, kind of have a lot of fun with any of these. All right, so that's kind of emitters. The one emitter that I didn't go over is OBJ. I feel like those are a little in depth. And again, this is one of those areas where this isn't something that particular can really do. This is something that Trapcode Form can do. You can bring in an OBJ and source it. And you can also have depth of field and use a light source. So it's pretty flexible and fun to use inside of Form. But what Stardust gives you is even more options than just using the vertices. Here I have a couple of setups just to walk through. If we just click on the actual object emitter though and come down to the bottom, you can see what I'm talking about. Underneath the object properties, you have a couple of options. You have face outline, volume, face, and surface. And then I have two different rendering particle types. If we go look at those, you can see under the shape, you have circle, and then another option you have is face. So here I'm emitting along the vertices. And if I just change this, you can see emitting along the outlines of the faces. And if I turn on this one, you can see rendering the actual faces themselves. And also, well, I have a turbulence plugged into it, which is really nice because you can control the rotation of those faces. You can do a lot of things with those faces, but I'm just trying to show you what it can read from OBJ. And then also you can emit from the surface. So if I plug that into there, and again, this is a particle system, it's not a static object like in form. You know, form, you can do layer maps and you have a lot of customization, but you really can't use it as a particle. It doesn't have a life and a death, and you couldn't do an auxiliary system. Whereas here, you know, I could add an auxiliary system to it and start emitting from it. So it's really flexible. I have a couple of tests just to show, you know, this is emitting from the face outline, and it was just a low poly geo, so then I'm just emitting along the edges and adding an auxiliary system and turbulence. This is rendering the faces, and then I'm affecting the rotation of those faces with a custom particle, and the rotation is being affected by the turbulence, which is, you know, kind of cool. And this last example I have is a cube with all the vertices, and then it's being affected by a deformer, which is a cube, which is also pushing the position of those particles outwards. So you can see you can get some kind of really interesting effects when you start combining these. This is using face outline and vertices. There's some really fun combinations that can be had with this. I don't know what this is. Over there. So that is kind of OBJs in a nutshell. I know I'm flying through this stuff, but again, I'm just trying to do kind of an overview. Auxiliary particles, I kind of mentioned those here where I was emitting from the source. To talk a little bit about the difference between these two again. And earlier I mentioned with particular, you basically have one emitter and one auxiliary. So like here, I've set the auxiliary system to emit over the life of the particle, and I've just chosen to emit from like 75 to 85% of its life so that you get something towards the end. And then I have like a similar setup on Stardust. But what's nice is that since you're in a node-based workflow, you can just infinitely chain this out. So I can just add another auxiliary to those particles, and here I've set them to emit from, scroll down here, just to, you know, 100% of those life, but they're emitting at the end of the life from the first system. So you can kind of start getting some really cool setups based on life, which is kind of like events and like pflow or something. It's a lot of flexibility and customization. I've set up one quick example in here, kind of like a shooter where I have a null, and as it rotates, it shoots out a particle, creates a trail, and at the end of it, it has custom animation for like a little shoot, I don't know. But just to kind of show you the flexibility in that. And then I have a couple of pre-rendered stuff that, you know, you can get really fancy with. You know, this is firework. Oh, sorry, that's not it. So here's some fireworks that I made, again, where there's like, you know, mortar and a trail and a burst. And you can see that, you know, there's like multiple particle rendering types. There's some glows. Here's growing, which is really interesting, again, along the path. And then just having particles emit, you know, randomly along that path, and then emit again once they reach the end of their life to create this kind of like leaf system. I've had a lot of fun creating lightning with this, which is, you know, chaining multiple particles and auxiliaries together to create chain lightning. And I can show setup for that, which looks crazy, I promise. It's crazier than it looks just because I was mixing in a couple of things. In this example, I was adding in rain. So I just wanted to force for that, but just to show you again, this like node-based workflow, here's my base emitter, particle, auxiliary particle, auxiliary particle, auxiliary particle, and then down to the very last auxiliary. So again, you can kind of create some very complex and interesting setups with the workflow that they've given you. With that, moving to the next particle texture, which again, just looking at the difference with this is something that really you couldn't do with particular. So I'm looking at form. I created a grid with sprites and custom particles and applying it through the layer maps. Or actually, it's just a particle texture, sorry, applying it through here. But the difference here I'm showing is that you can only pick one side of this, whereas with Stardust, what is really nice, if you pick a texture, it allows you to pick the front and back, and then also lets you colorize it based on the lightness or alpha of it, which is cool. So then if you had another color here, it'll color it based on that. But I have a deformer, both of these are the same thing, where I have a deformer that's rotating in the middle, that's affecting the rotation. Except on Stardust, when it's affecting it, you can see we're able to see the backside and get kind of a more complex animation out of it. You can also affect individual accesses through turbulence. Here I'm using, a field, and just to pipe in a layer map, which is just a black and white image that is controlling this. It's just diamonds rotating. But you can control just a single axis. Here I'm controlling the x-axis, but you could do like x and y, or you could do just z. It's really dynamic and allows for just a lot more flexibility in what you're trying to accomplish with your setup. Nodes, I opened up the fireworks one again, just to show you what that system actually looks like. So again, I have 3 rendering particle types for one emitter, and then I'm using those to emit auxiliaries from, and then I'm affecting, I'm using turbulence to only affect 2 parts of that animation, rather than affecting all of it. Gravity, just on certain areas, and another gravity down here, because I wanted to add spin to some of these. Or it's just nice to be able to isolate things and gives you a level of control where you're not worrying about just one physics systems for the entire particles, but you're actually affecting individual elements, which if you get into something like here, I have a UI setup that I made, you're able to kind of create isolated elements. I'm using mask, I'm using rings, and I'm making auxiliaries from some of those, and then I'm also kind of using the replica to kind of multiply certain elements, and then able to apply different particle rendering types to individual things. But again, this is all in one system, and I'm able, it's just a lot of flexibility and control, and you can really art direct what kind of effect you're going for. I've just found this workflow and being able to isolate things all in one layer is so helpful and easier to kind of get in there and really hone into the effect that you're looking to create. So this node-based is really a game changer in how you really think about the type of systems you're making and how you want to use them in scenes. And then the next one I have here is time, but this is also something you can kind of do in particular with the physics factor. You can animate that to 0 and freeze the particles. With Stardust, you get at the top a just timer map checkbox. So what it does is looks at the full system animation and then is using the seconds of it as a timer map. So if I turn this back on, you can see that I've set keyframes for the seconds, and then it kind of stops, slows down, do a bullet time rotation, and then continue back into its life. Again, nothing completely different from particular, but it is nice that it's built in up there. Okay, and then the last thing that I have here is and more. There is so much more that I'm not talking about. I was trying to gloss over the surface and not get too nitty gritty, but there's the replica that I used a few times, which just is an amazing tool, and it's got a completely own video all by itself, but just gives you the ability to quickly, replicate your system, and it's really fast, doesn't bog it down, and you have a lot of control over where you're emitting from, whether it's like, the particle position, the emitter position, where the particle was born at. There's just a plethora of different types of replicates that you can do. It's really deep and it's really flexible. Again, I keep saying flexible, but it's really a creative plugin, and it opens up and allows you to kind of be imaginative in how you want to use it and create some really interesting effects. I was using the turbulence, but I didn't really go over it. There's wind. There's fields, which I showed a singular use of them. The fields, I was just showing that you can map, layers if you wanted by using the maps part of it. That, like, I was using it for the rotation on the grid particles. But there's a bunch of stuff, as you can see, and I've laid out a couple of them here because I think they're really powerful tools that aren't found really in any other system like this. Here, it's just using a sphere to kind of color and move the particles, but you can do a box. I have a box set up, which is the same result, but box. And at the top, which is nice, if you go into render settings, you can turn on helper preview, and you can actually see, which is kind of faint, but you can see what the deformer is doing and what it looks like. So if I go to another one, you can actually use OBJs. I don't know why I keep connecting them. I only have one system in here, but there's an OBJ. I brought in a cube OBJ, and it's affecting the position and opacity and size and color. I could turn that off. I have a bend, which is crazy that you can do bends on your systems, and again, it really isn't overhead at all. It's super fast and does really crazy cool things. You can pick your axis and move it around. It's pretty cool to have that ability. There's also a spiral, and then the last one I have here is a twist. Just, again, with the creative possibilities, it's really only limited to how you're kind of looking at the system and what you want to make. But it's nice that you can throw these on and they don't bog it down. It doesn't slow it down. Keeps it fast and very intuitive and fun to play with. Cool. And the very last thing, I guess, is I would recommend going to their site, downloading the trial, playing with it, and also looking at their support. Their user guide is well written, in depth, covers all of the features and what their intention with them is. There's things that I'm still not covering, like clone and shading and your custom source and motion. There's just transforms. There's a lot of stuff here to play with, but I just wanted to give the general overview of like why these two are really not in the same league and they're completely different, and I hope that changes people's minds and kind of opens them up to using this in their workflow. I've started using it in production lately, and I really think the team has hit a home run here, and it's things that I've been wanting in After Effects for a really long time, and even features that I didn't really think that I could get in After Effects. I hope to do some more tutorials to possibly walk through some of these other animations that I've made. I've just been making a bunch of different animations to try to explore what type of work you can make with it. You can follow me on Instagram, Fried Pixels, if you want to follow along with some of those tests or look at old ones. Again, I hope you enjoy it, and I'm sorry if this video was really long. I tried to cut it down, but I'm not very good at this, and I hope you can excuse that. I just wanted to share a little bit of my excitement for Stardust. That's it. Thank you.